So tonight we're going to talk about Lehi's journey from Jerusalem to Bountiful. This is one of the areas of the Book of Mormon that's frequently attacked by the critics. To many, this is just unimaginable. This idea that Lehi is going to travel roughly 2,000 miles through some of the most remote and difficult terrain in the ancient world. There's all sorts of parts of this story that people find implausible. For example, they take issue with the phrase "land of Jerusalem" and its use in the Book of Mormon, and they argue that no part of Palestine bears the name land of Jerusalem except the city itself. Critics have asserted that offering sacrifices outside the Temple of Jerusalem was a violation of the commandment given in Deuteronomy 12. And as such, that doesn't seem to match the idea that Lehi and his family are strict observers of the law of Moses. But perhaps more than any other criticism, the journey's Achilles' heel has been the seeming impossibility of Nephi discovering a place he named Bountiful in the desert of Arabia, a lush coastal place of water, fruit, trees, and honeybees. It doesn't seem to match anything that's known in that part of the world. But from the very beginning, once the Book of Mormon was published, there's been attacks on the idea of Bountiful. This is from 1831, so a year after the Book of Mormon was published. It's from the Christian Watchman. And it says, after Lehi and his family had wandered in the wilderness, they came to a fertile country, which they call the land Bountiful. This must have been on the coast of the Sea of Arabia or in the Indian Ocean, which is a barren, sandy desert. The historical part of the book is all of it, thus fabulous and extravagant. To believe the Book of Mormon, we must suppose that these immigrants discovered a country almost equal to paradise, where nobody else can find anything but a sandy, barren desert. It's not just in ancient times, even in modern times. Here's a quote from Dr. Thomas Key, a biologist, who wrote, "There are numerous scientific problems in the Book of Mormon. 1 Nephi 17:5 is a description of Arabia, which is called bountiful because of its much fruit and also wild honey. Arabia is bountiful in sunshine, petroleum, sand, heat, and fresh air, but certainly not in much fruit and wild honey, nor has it been since creation times. 1 Nephi 18:1 indicates that the Jews made a ship from ample timber in Arabia. The same objection above applies here. How is it possible that they could find a place such as Bountiful in the deserts of Arabia that would match the Book of Mormon? It doesn't seem plausible." So we'll talk about that tonight. As we think about Lehi's journey to the coast, there's 5 places that are specifically named in the account. We have Jerusalem, the valley of Lemuel and the river Laman, we have Shazer, we have Nahom, and we have Bountiful. So we'll talk about each one of these. As they traveled from Jerusalem to Bountiful, it was more than 2,000 miles, and it took the group 8 years. So this was a prolonged, extended journey. Now to start, we have to ask, why are they traveling through Arabia anyway? If Jerusalem's going to be destroyed and Lehi's warned to flee, why not go north or east or west? Why head south into the desert? Well, there's a couple reasons for this. The first is Assyria was to the north and was weakening in power. Babylonia to the east was gaining power, and Egypt to the west. So Urijah was a contemporary of Lehi. He's spoken of in the Bible. He prophesied against Jerusalem, and he fled to Egypt. He was extradited and slain by Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, who reigned from 609 to 598 BC. So it didn't work out too well for his contemporaries to flee to Egypt. He clearly couldn't go to Assyria or Babylonia. And so his only choice was to head south into the deserts of Arabia. So they departed into the wilderness. Here on the right, you can see the topography of ancient Israel. And on the far right, you can see the ancient roads that were known. It's very likely that they traveled down to the Dead Sea and from there southward. Here in 1 Nephi, we read, "And it came to pass that he departed into the wilderness, and he left his house and the land of his inheritance and his gold and his silver and his precious things, and took nothing with him save it were his family and provisions and tents, and departed into the wilderness." Now, there's a couple interesting things about this. The first is the Book of Mormon has absolute internal consistency in its use of elevation as a key descriptor of ancient travel. And what that means is every time they talk about going to Jerusalem, they go up to the land of Jerusalem. And every time they leave Jerusalem, they talk about coming down from the land of Jerusalem. Well, this obviously matches the topography because Jerusalem's up on a hill. And this precedent that Nephi set was actually continued by all the other writers in the Book of Mormon. So for example, if you look at the city of Zarahemla, every time they come up out of the land of Zarahemla, it talks about them rising in elevation, and every time they go to Zarahemla, they come down into the land of Zarahemla. There's an absolute internal consistency. And in fact, I've read every direction given from every city in the Book of Mormon, and every single one of them is consistent relative to each other about traveling upwards or downwards in elevation. This was something that Nephi started and was continued all throughout. It's a remarkable testament that Joseph Smith couldn't write the Book of Mormon himself. The complexity, the consistency, remembering how each of the cities are relative to each other in elevation would have been mind-boggling if you were writing this in the 1800s. Now, the land of their inheritance was down from Jerusalem. Oftentimes when you look at like some of the videos that they put out on Lehi and Jerusalem, or like even the cartoon versions, you'll see them going to their house at Jerusalem, inside the city of Jerusalem. The Book of Mormon never says that. The Book of Mormon does not say he lived inside the walls of the city of Jerusalem. It simply says that they lived at Jerusalem. And therefore, when they're at Jerusalem, for example, they say, therefore, let us go down to the land of our father's inheritance. That implies, because it's a change in elevation, it's not at Jerusalem. Their father's land of inheritance was somewhere else, somewhere in the surrounding area. This is probably why Sariah got so concerned about her children. They were gone to Jerusalem, and they were gone for an extended period of time because they made a detour to go down to the land of their inheritance to gather up their precious things to try to buy the brass plates from Laban. Because that would have taken a significant amount of time to go down and then come back up to Jerusalem, this is probably why she began to be so worried, and she supposed that her sons had perished in the wilderness and mourned because of them. But wait a minute, Brother Hendrickson, doesn't the text plainly state that Lehi dwelt at Jerusalem in all his days? Isn't that fair enough reason to assume that he lived inside the city walls? Well, let's look at it carefully. So a careful reading of the text reveals that there's a difference between dwelling at Jerusalem and dwelling inside the city of Jerusalem. So for example, Lehi, having dwelt at Jerusalem in all his days, he returned to his own house at Jerusalem and cast himself upon his bed. Neither did they believe that Jerusalem, that great city, could be destroyed, and they were like unto the Jews who were at Jerusalem. And the last one, for I had tarried at Jerusalem, I had perished with my brethren. So how do we know that at Jerusalem doesn't refer directly to the city itself? Well, think about the passages where we talk about the prophecies of Christ. For example, it says, he shall be born of Mary at Jerusalem, which is in the land of our forefathers, she being a virgin. Clearly, everyone knows that that Jesus was born at Bethlehem, which is roughly 5 miles south of the city of Jerusalem. And yet the Book of Mormon still refers to Bethlehem as at Jerusalem. It's these surrounding areas. Think about Christ when he ministered to people throughout the region, north and south. The Lord himself described his ministry as being at Jerusalem, even though it wasn't limited to just the city walls. Jacob prophesied that Christ would show himself to those at Jerusalem from whence he came, and he obviously did that throughout the region. And the descendants of Lehi asked, will he not show himself unto us as well as to those who are at Jerusalem? So contrary to popular belief, the text does not state that Lehi lived inside the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Now, the critics have taken issue with this phrase, the land of Jerusalem. This idea that Lehi was led out of the land of Jerusalem and not out of the city of Jerusalem. Why did they take issue with that? Because the phrase land of Jerusalem does not appear in the Bible. And so here you can see this is from Mormonism Exposed from 1838. And you can see the quote here, there is no such land, no part of Palestine bears the name Jerusalem except the city itself. And then here on the bottom right, you can see Joseph Smith receiving a kick from an evil spirit upon finding the golden plates. And so they say this is evidence the Book of Mormon is false. There is no such place as the land of Jerusalem or living at Jerusalem. There's only the city and the city walls. So the question is logically asked, is there any evidence that the land of Jerusalem was an authentic term in use in Lehi's day? Well, we actually have great evidence of this now that's been discovered. Here on the right, these are the caves, the 11 different caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found near Qumran. And the one you're seeing on the far right is cave number 4, where the temple scroll and the Apocryphon of Jeremiah was found. The Dead Sea Scrolls reference the land of Jerusalem. So let me read this quote on the left. This is from Jeff Lindsay, one of my favorite independent scholars. Joseph Smith has long been ridiculed for his blunder in Alma 7:10 about Christ being born in the land of Jerusalem, when everyone knows it was in the town of Bethlehem. This attack could be neutralized with logic, but now ancient documents, such as the Amarna letters and the Dead Sea Scrolls, revealed that the land of Jerusalem, a phrase not found in the Bible, was an authentic term among the ancient people describing the region around Jerusalem, including nearby Bethlehem. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls is the Apocryphon of Jeremiah. It contains a story about Jeremiah that references captives from the land of Jerusalem being escorted to Babylon. A second source in antiquity for the land of Jerusalem come from the Amarna letters. Now, what are the Amarna letters? These letters are the correspondence from rulers of several of the Canaanite city-states to the Egyptian pharaoh in the mid-14th century BC. They include letters from Abdi-Heba, the ruler of Jerusalem at the time. Three of Abdi-Heba's letters, El Amarna 287, El Amarna 289, and El Amarna 290, refer to the land of Jerusalem. For example, this one's from letter 287. The king has set his name upon the land of Jerusalem forever, so he cannot abandon the land of Jerusalem. Here's other lines from other Amarna letters that also reference the land or the city of Jerusalem. We have the land of the city of Jerusalem, the land of the city of Jerusalem, a place, the land of Jerusalem, the lands of the city of Jerusalem, and a city of the land of Jerusalem. So the Book of Mormon uses the phrase the land of Jerusalem 40 different times, even though it's not found in the Bible. We now know from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Amarna letters, this was an ancient term in use in the time of Lehi. This is something that Joseph Smith simply couldn't have known in the 1800s. There's other interesting things that Joseph couldn't have known if he was fabricating this story. For example, you all know the story when Laman and Lemuel are murmuring against Nephi, and they say, "How is it possible that the Lord will deliver Laban into our hands? Behold, he is a mighty man. He can command 50. Yea, even he can slay 50. Then why not us?" The question becomes, why do they say 50? Why not 100 or 1,000 or 50,000? Why do they reference 50 when saying he's a powerful man? Well, in the Amarna letters, Abdu-Hebda specifically requested 50 men as a garrison to guard the land. Several other letters mention 50-man garrisons as well, and it appears to be a common or standard unit for a garrison in that time period. We also have letters from both Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires that also indicate that 50 men was the standard military unit in the first millennium BC. And so there's ample evidence that this was the standard term, and hence Laman and Lemuel say, hey, Laban can command a garrison. How can we stand up to him? Surely he can slay us. Hugh Nibley wrote this quote below. He says, "As to Laban's garrison of 50, it seems pitifully small for a great city. It would have been just as easy for the author of 1 Nephi to have said 50,000 and made it really impressive. The number 50 suits perfectly well with the Amarna picture, where military forces are always so surprisingly small. It is strikingly vindicated in a letter of Nebuchadnezzar, Lehi's contemporary, wherein the great king orders, 'As to the 50s who are under your command, those gone to the rear or fugitives return to their ranks.'" And so there's multiple sources showing that the standard garrison at the time was a 50-man garrison. Now, as they travel from Jerusalem down towards the Red Sea, they're going to pass by a very famous place. It's the copper mines of Timna. This is where they were mining copper. It was active in Lehi's day. There's absolute archaeological evidence and remnants from the mines. And we know that somehow Nephi learned and gained an ability to work with metals. He had an appreciation for fine metal work. For example, he made the plates upon which he wrote with his own hands. That would have been a skill that was unusual in that time period. And clearly he must have been near mines or metallurgy or a place where he could have gained that skill. When he sees the sword of Laban for the first time, remember what he says? He says, "I beheld his sword, and the workmanship thereof was exceedingly fine. And I saw that the blade thereof was of the most precious steel." He's impressed by the fine metalwork. When he sees the Liahona, the first thing he says is he beheld upon the ground a round ball of curious workmanship, and it was of fine brass. Nephi clearly was unusual in his training and his upbringing and his metallurgy skills. And again, it's a detail that would have been hard for Joseph Smith to weave in without knowing that the copper mines of Timna had great metallurgy in that day and age and would have offered Nephi opportunities to learn those skills. Now, as Lehi leaves Jerusalem and he heads out into the wilderness, we have to really understand what's happening here. Lehi was a wealthy individual. He had lands of his own inheritance, as we talked about. He had gold and silver and precious things that Nephi refers to. And he leaves all those things behind, and Nephi takes the time to record that his father dwelt in a tent. I remember when I was in primary being puzzled by this verse, and my father dwelt in a tent. But this was a massive change for Lehi and his family. Having come from wealth and privilege and society and civilization to now be living like the Bedouins with tents likely made of goat hair in the wilderness would have been quite the change in scenery. And I think we have to have a little bit of compassion for Laman and Lemuel, having been raised with privilege, now all of a sudden giving up all that privilege and having to go out into the desert. Here's a quote from Daniel Peterson, one of my favorite scholars. He says, Lehi is a very wealthy person living on the outskirts of Jerusalem. His two older spoiled sons have grown up quite comfortably in Jerusalem, and they are looking forward to the day when they will inherit all that property. What they see in their father is he has betrayed their situation. He's become this religious fanatic who's going to take them away from their place that is rightfully theirs, deprive them of their status and the comforts that they are used to. Now, Laman being the eldest, he's the first to murmur, and then Lemuel follows him. And we see this time and time again. Almost immediately after departing into the wilderness, Laman and Lemuel begin murmuring about the loss of their precious things. Here's from 1 Nephi chapter 2. Laman and Lemuel did murmur in many things against their father, because he was a visionary man, and he led them out of the land of Jerusalem to leave the land of their inheritance and their gold and their silver and their precious things, to perish in the wilderness. And this they said he had done because of the foolish imaginations of his heart. Why would Laman have more cause to murmur than Lehi's other sons? Well, there is a valid reason. As the birthright son, Laman was entitled to receive a double portion of the family inheritance. From the time of his birth, he would be expecting the majority share of all of that wealth to fall to him. And now they've left all that wealth behind. Think about when they flee from Laman and have to leave their wealth in his hands. Nephi records, Laman was angry with me and also with my father, and also was Lemuel, for he hearkened unto the words of Laman. But it was first Laman that was angry, and then Lemuel followed. Laman and Lemuel were so upset, they were like unto the Jews who were at Jerusalem, who sought to take away the life of my father. So you must ask yourself the logical question, if Laman and Lemuel are so upset by leaving Jerusalem, why don't they just return? Why don't they just leave their father, leave Nephi and their mother, and just return to the land by themselves? Well, in that culture, in that day and age, that would have been a total shame to them and their family, and they likely would have been rejected by those that they tried to go back and live with. Here's William Hamblin. They went with their father because loyalty to the father is absolute in the Middle East. They take out their anxiety and their animosity to their father on their brother Lehi. This again is a cultural trait from that period and that era of the world that Joseph Smith simply couldn't have known. So Lehi's family camps in a valley by the side of a river of water, which they named the Valley of Lemuel and the River Laman. And they came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea, and he traveled in the wilderness and the borders, which are nearer the Red Sea. And he did travel in the wilderness with his family, which consisted of my mother, Sariah, my elder brothers, who were Laman, Lemuel, and Sam. And it came to pass, when they had traveled 3 days in the wilderness, he pitched his tent by a valley by the side of a river of water. So we must ask ourselves, is it plausible that Lehi and his family encountered a valley by the side of a river of water in this geographic region as described in the Book of Mormon? I'd like to share with you Wadi Tayyib al-Ism. This is one of the leading candidates for the Valley of Lemuel and the River Laman. And it shows that such a place is plausible within the geography that was described. Here you can see from Google Maps this canyon that empties out into the Red Sea. This is what it looks like during certain times of the year. Here's where it connects to the ocean. There's actually a highway there now that drives across it between the ocean and the entrance to the canyon, but this is Wadi Tayyib al-Ism. The Book of Mormon claim that there is a valley by the side of a river of water within 3 days' journey from the borders near the shore of the Red Sea is completely plausible. This wasn't known until the last few decades. For the first 100 years of the Book of Mormon, it wasn't known whether this was plausible or not to have this valley of Lemuel and a river that Lehi could name Laman. Now, there's contextual clues that indicate that Lehi and the group likely spent a significant amount of time in the Valley of Lemuel. Let me just give you a few examples. We know that when they got there, they offered sacrifice. We know that Nephi and his brothers returned to Jerusalem twice, once to get the brass plates, and then again to get wives and bring Ishmael with them. They searched the brass plates to learn their genealogy. The marriages of Nephi, Zoram, and his brothers happened at the valley of Lemuel. There was a vision of the tree of life was given, and they prepared for their long desert journey ahead. They also took time to gather all manner of seeds. This implies there was at least one growing season that was likely while they were there, if not many more. Just a quick side note on the gathering of seeds by the Red Sea. For those that have come to our Mesoamerican presentations where we talk about Book of Mormon evidences in the New World, it's interesting that when they gathered these seeds, it specifically says they were on the borders near the shore of the Red Sea. And if you fast forward to their future journey where they plant those seeds in the Americas, it says they did grow exceedingly, therefore we were blessed in abundance. Now, when we lived in Oregon, we grew blueberries, and we moved to Arizona, our blueberries wouldn't grow. And when we lived in Arizona, we grew citrus fruit, and when we moved to Utah, we tried to grow citrus fruit, and of course it doesn't grow. And now we live in Folsom, California, and we grow all sorts of things here we couldn't grow in other geographies. The point is that certain seeds and certain plants only grow at certain latitudes and have to have certain climates. When Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon, the massive civilizations that lived in Mesoamerica were unknown at the time. It wasn't until 1841 when Stephen and Catherwoods returned from their journeys in Mesoamerica did the world get its first glimpse of how sophisticated and large the civilizations were in Mesoamerica during Book of Mormon times. Now, there's some other interesting things about the Valley of Lemuel. So one of the things is, first they traveled 3 days in the wilderness before they pitched their tent in this valley by the side of a river of water. And it came to pass that Lehi built an altar of stones and made offerings unto the Lord and gave thanks unto the Lord our God. Now, Lehi's offering sacrifices outside of the Jerusalem temple seems to be a violation of the commandment given in Deuteronomy 12, which has been interpreted by some as stipulating that sacrifices are only to be offered at the temple of Jerusalem. If this is so, then the Book of Mormon would appear to contradict the biblical record, which might call into question the authenticity of Lehi and his family as being strict observers of the law of Moses. BYU professor David Rolfe Seeley offers a few insights here that I think are notable. He says, first, it's possible that Deuteronomy 12 did not intend to eliminate all sacrifice away from the main sanctuary. In fact, altars and sacrifice and even other temples continued at various places outside of Jerusalem, which is unquestionably verified by archaeology. Second, Melchizedek priesthood holders were not bound by the centralization of worship as prescribed in Deuteronomy 12, which would make sense in the case of Lehi because he was a non-Levite. He held the Melchizedek priesthood, and the prophets in the Book of Mormon officiated by the Melchizedek priesthood, not by the Aaronic priesthood. And third, and finally, Deuteronomy 12 may have been interpreted anciently as applying only to the land of Israel, meaning once you leave the land of Israel, the rules no longer apply. All good points made by Professor Seeley, but I think we have even stronger evidence that's been discovered. So this is the temple scroll. It was discovered in 1956 in Cave 11 with the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the longest of all of the scrolls that has been discovered. It's over 8 meters long. And I want to read to you a passage from the temple scroll here. It says, "You shall not slaughter a clean ox or sheep or goat in all your towns near to my temple within a distance of 3 days' journey. Nay, but inside my temple you shall slaughter it, making it a burnt offering or a peace offering." The temple scroll, which explains the instructions of God to Moses concerning the temple, specifically says that if you're within a 3 days' journey, you need to make your sacrifices at the temple. This is likely the reason why Nephi goes to great lengths to point out that first they traveled for 3 days into the wilderness before they stopped to make offerings unto the Lord. It wasn't that they weren't thankful to the Lord on day 1, and they weren't thankful to the Lord on day 2, and only became thankful on day 3. It's that they were abiding by the ancient instructions of the Lord to Moses. This instruction and this commandment to only issue at the temple within a 3 days' journey was not known in Joseph Smith's day. In fact, it wasn't known anywhere until 1956 when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. It's another detail that Joseph Smith could not possibly have known or woven into his story. Now, Nephi records that they did go forth into the wilderness to slay food for our families, and they did suffer much for the want of food. Well, obviously, in the deserts of Arabia, animals are scarce. But it was even worse than that, because you have to remember that there's several Arabian animals that you can't eat under the Mosaic law. So for example, camels are specifically prohibited, as are rabbits and hyraxes. You can see pictures there on the bottom left. Animals that you could eat would be ox, sheep, goat, deer, gazelle, wild goats, ibex, antelope, and mountain sheep, all things that you can find in the deserts of Arabia that you could eat. And yet, I wonder how many times Nephi saw one of these Arabian hares or rabbits and thought to himself, I'm really hungry, I wish I could go eat one of those. He offers some interesting wordplay that leads me to believe there may have been times where out of necessity he had to hunt animals, even if they were against the law of Moses. Here's a quote by Warren Ashton. He says, desert animals that would not have been allowable for food under the Mosaic law include the hyena, the baboon, the wolf, the fox, the leopard, the lion, and snakes. So, some of these animals help us understand Nephi's earlier reference to being bound with cords by his brothers and left in the wilderness to be devoured by wild beast. In particular, hyenas, who often hunted in packs, would have offered a formidable threat to anyone unarmed and alone in the desert. And so which is it? Is it the desert so full of animals that if you're left alone, you're going to be eaten? Or is it there's no animals and therefore you're starving? Only once you understand what's prohibited by the law of Moses do those two seemingly contradictory statements make sense. If you look at Nephi's record in chapter 16, he seems to differentiate between slaying food and slaying wild beasts, right? When things are good, they go to slay food. After things become really bad and they start starving, he goes and inquires of the Lord, and he goes to the top of a mountain according to the directions which were upon the Leahona, and he says he did slay wild beasts and brought them back to his family to eat. Now, his change in vocabulary here may indicate that he was slaying animals that normally he wouldn't have slain or considered food. Okay, so after crossing the river Laman and traveling for 4 days, the group arrived at a place which they named Shazer. Now, Shazer's interesting. This is a quote from Hugh Nibley. And he talks about how the word Shazer denotes a weak but reliable water supply, a clump of trees, kind of like an oasis in many Arab languages. The root of the word Shazer implies that water supply and a clump of trees. There's actually 2 large oasis areas that are candidates for Shazer. The one that I'm going to show you is Wadi Agar. In Arabic, the name may be related to the term meaning a clump of trees. If the name refers to trees, 2 present locations reveal themselves as candidate. Roughly 4 days travel southeast of where the Valley of Lemuel must have been, there are 2 large oases. Here's Wadi Agar, and you can see there's fresh water, plant life, and vegetation in the desert. It would have been a place that you could come and you could rest of your travels and you could kind of recharge yourself and prepare for future journey on the travel. It was also a known stop on the frankincense trail, so it would have been a logical place that would have been known for people to stop. Now, it's important to understand that once they leave the Valley of Lemuel and they get to Shazer, never again do they reference the Red Sea. Never again do they see the ocean until they arrive at Bountiful. Now, that's an important detail because it indicates they're likely traveling on the east side of the Hijaz Mountains. Here's a few more pictures of Shazer so you can see what that oasis looks like. I want to read this verse from 1 Nephi chapter 2, verse 5, which doesn't make any sense. It says, and he came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea, and he traveled in the wilderness in the borders, which are nearer the Red Sea. That vocabulary and that word usage doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to us in English, until you realize that local Arabs state that the name of the mountains there that follow the Red Sea are known as the borders. The Hijaz mountain range means borders in their local language. And in Hebrew, the word for borders is a cognate with the Egyptian Jebel, meaning mountain. So references to the borders near the Red Sea could logically refer to the mountains. This is almost certainly the case. Think about Nephi and his family when they're starving. Nephi doesn't say, we went down to the Red Sea to get some fish, right? Or we went down to the sea to trade with the merchants who were known to come up and sail up through the Red Sea in that time and age. Instead, he says he went up into the mountain to hunt for food. He's clearly traveling on the eastern side of the Hijaz mountain range. And in fact, if he tried to go on the western side, the side of the mountains that goes down to touch the Red Sea, there's several places where it's completely impassable. where there's steep cliffs, where you simply have no ability to travel on that side of the mountain range. And so if he's traveling in a south-southeast direction, as he tells us he is, he's on the east side of this mountain range. And that's why he never again references the Red Sea in the text. He only references the Great Sea once they get to the land Bountiful on the southern coast of Arabia. So if they're traveling along the mountain ranges, that would make a ton of sense. Why? Because mountain ranges offered cooler traveling conditions and occasional fertile pockets where crops could be grown. Small villages spaced among the natural valleys between the ranges offered fodder for animals, food, and water for travelers. When it would rain, the rain would run down the mountains, and you would have small pockets of watering holes and oases where you could stop to get water. Another important point to make is that camels typically have to have stable footing. This idea we see from Hollywood, where you see these camels going out over these sand dunes, is all Hollywood. It's not really true. Once loaded, camels need to keep to level ground. Thus, trails tended to follow plateaus and valley bases through the mountain ranges, which is at odds with the popular image of camels crossing rolling golden sand dunes. Even if the route was much longer, they would stick to a windy road that had stable footing for the camels to travel, rather than trying to cross over a more direct route over the sand dunes. And so this makes a ton of sense. And this is why when Nephi broke his bow, where does he go? He goes up into the mountain to find food, because that's where all the wild animals, a greater number of wild animals would live, where it was cooler temperatures and had greater access to water and food. Now, if they're traveling on the east side of the mountain range, what they're actually traveling on is the ancient Incense trade route. Since watering holes don't move, modern mapping allows us to reconstruct the ancient desert highways with a fairly high degree of certainty, something that simply wasn't possible in the 1830s and something Joe Smith couldn't have possibly known. Here you can see the ancient Incense trade route recreated, and you see it follows the eastern side of the mountain range there along the borders of the Red Sea. Now, why was there an incense trade route in the first place? And why would Lehi and his family logically have followed it? Well, incense, such as frankincense and myrrh, were highly valued in ancient times. So for more than 1,000 years, no item traded from Arabia approached the importance of frankincense and myrrh. These are gum aromatics, they're incenses, they're hardened resin from trees. And so these were useful to Israelites and also to those in Egypt. So for example, in early Israel, God commanded Moses to burn incense and to make perfume for the use of the portable tabernacle according to a precise formula. Now you have to remember the ancient tabernacle and the ancient temple was a disgusting, horrible smelling place. You had dead carcasses everywhere for the animal sacrifices. You had blood and stench everywhere you went. And so having this sweet smelling incense was almost critical just to enable people to stand the smell of the tabernacle. Incense, including frankincense, was burnt upon altars, in censers, and in spoons fashioned after a cupped hand. This idea of burning incense in a hand in cupping shape is prevalent throughout the ancient world. You see that in Egypt, you see that in ancient Israel. Egyptian writings dating back to 1500 BC mention other uses for frankincense and myrrh. Their oil was used to perfume royal mummies. In fact, we have some instructions on how to embalm ancient mummies, and it always included the use of myrrh. And so there was high demand for myrrh in Egypt because of that. Here on the right, I've highlighted the main areas that were production areas for incense. And so there was an ongoing incense trade in Lehi's day where people would travel down to Yemen and to Oman to gather incense and then export it back up to Egypt, Israel, and above. Here's what frankincense looks like if you've never seen it before. And so it's literally the gum or the resin that comes from these trees. And I thought I would just show you what a frankincense tree looks like. This was from a natural park in Dhofar, Oman. But this is what a frankincense tree looks like. What you do is you go up to the frankincense tree and you take a knife and you make small slashes in the bark. And what happens is, over a period of days, the tree bleeds. And that resin hardens, and then you come back and you can gather that resin. And when you burn the resin, that's what has the sweet smell, and why it became valuable. This quote here on the left talks about how when they would slash these trees, it was ritualistic. They would make small slashes in the bark of a tree. It was almost like you were bleeding the tree a little bit. And then you would come back and get it once it had dried. Harvesters were careful not to overharvest, and they treated their trees almost like they would livestock because they were a source of wealth and income to them. They cared for them and tended to them. There's several ancient legends about these trees being inhabited by numerous amounts of snakes. And so it could be folklore, but it was said that harvesting frankincense was a very dangerous profession due to all the snakes that tended to gather around the frankincense. So in addition to its use as a perfume, frankincense was valued for its medicinal qualities. It was known to heal people anciently. So we find frankincense prescribed for various conditions, including paralysis, hemorrhaging. It was used as a treatment for headaches and nausea, dysentery, and fever. And even today in Yemen, there's a beverage that they make from pounded frankincense, and it's thought to help reduce inflammation. Symbolically, Jesus Christ is the tree of life. We see that throughout the Book of Mormon. In Psalms and in Jeremiah, we read that Jesus Christ is like a tree planted by the rivers of water, and his covenant people are called trees of righteousness. Just as the sap of a wounded frankincense tree heals physically, the blood of Jesus Christ heals us spiritually. As such, Jesus Christ was wounded for our transgressions, and with his stripes, we are healed. Because of this symbolism, the symbolism of the bleeding tree that gives life and heals, it's completely fitting that of the three gifts brought to the Christ child, they were presented unto him gold and frankincense and myrrh. Here on the right, this is the adoration of the Magi. I showed this in the last Fireside for a different purpose. I was calling out the inverted star at the top, the pentagram showing the divine ratio. And yet it also shows the gifts that were presented, including the frankincense and myrrh to the Christ child. Frankincense was symbolic of the priesthood and burnt offerings because of its use in the tabernacle. Myrrh also had deep symbolic meaning. Myrrh's the bitter oil that comes from the tree resin, and it was extremely valuable in the time when Christ was born. In the New Testament, myrrh is usually associated with embalming and burial because of its preservative qualities. Myrrh's medicinal uses can symbolize Christ's role as the master healer, and its burials can symbolize the bitter cup. Myrrh itself is very, very bitter to the taste. And so think about the symbolism of Christ when he's at Golgotha, and they give him to drink wine mingled with myrrh. They literally tried to give him a physical bitter cup while he was partaking of the true bitter cup, even the depths and agonies of the atonement. To Christ's body for burial, Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. From the very beginning, even from the time when the gifts were brought to the Christ child, the gifts foreshadowed Christ's ultimate victory over sin and death. The frankincense being symbolic of the priesthood power that he would use to raise himself from the dead, and the myrrh being used in embalming, symbolic of his ability to overcome the bitter cup and rise from the dead. So after the group departs Shazer, Nephi breaks his bow of fine steel, and his brothers lose their springs. I, Nephi, did break my bow, having been afflicted with my brethren because of the loss of my bow, and their bows having lost their springs. It began to be exceedingly difficult to obtain food. Well, one might logically ask, why did his brothers' bows lose their springs? They lost tension. What would cause that to happen? Well, if you look at the geography of ancient Arabia, Nephi and his family came from Jerusalem, the lands of Jerusalem, which is about 84 degrees in the summer. And they're traveling along the coast of Saudi Arabia. And if you look at Mecca, the temperature gets to about 112 degrees in the summer months. This is likely the reason why their bows lost their spring or lost their tension. It's a result of the change in climate from a cooler, moisture climate to the desert dry heat of Arabia. The temperature at Mecca is up to 35 degrees higher than Jerusalem. Small details like this are things that would be very hard to weave into the Book of Mormon story, and they witnessed to the authenticity of what was happening on this journey as a historical record. Now, I've mapped out all the references and metals to the Book of Mormon, and you can see there's gold, silver, iron, copper, brass, and steel. And then you can see the time periods in which they're mentioned. For example, iron, copper, brass, and steel die out very early in the Book of Mormon. They're not mentioned later on in the later histories. It appears that metallurgy and those skill sets were lost over time to the Nephites. But the question becomes, what ancient metal alloy is clearly missing from the list? There's clearly one that just doesn't make sense. There's one that's prevalent throughout the ancient world that's not shown here, and that is bronze. If you look at ancient metals, there's brass, which is copper and zinc, bronze, which is copper and tin, and then there's steel, which is iron and carbon. And if you look at the melting temperatures, steel melts at a significantly higher temperature than bronze or brass. And so this idea that bronze is not mentioned in the Book of Mormon is highly strange, since it was the most common ancient metal in the Old World and in the New World. By combining these elements, ancient man made alloys with preferred qualities such as greater strength, durability, and resistance to corrosion. And bronze was particularly prized because it was harder than brass, so it was a very hard metal. Now, it's important to understand that in the 18th century, there was no word for bronze in the English language. Therefore, the translators of the King James Version of the Bible, which obviously translated it before the 18th century, translated all of the words from Hebrew, the word nekoshah, as steel, even though modern translators would translate it as bronze. There's two separate words. There's nekushah and there's nekusheth. Nekusheth is translated as brass. Nekushah is translated as steel. And so the word bronze does not appear at all in the Bible or the Book of Mormon, even though it was one of the most widely used metals in the ancient world. As such, it's very likely that the steel referred to in the Book of Mormon is actually steeled or hardened bronze. The word steel just literally means to mix with metals to make a metal harder. Our conception of steel wasn't invented until the 19th century when we think of modern steel. But here I just showed you a photo. This is bronze arrows. There's also bronze bows that were unearthed in Oman in 2016. And you can see these ancient bronze weapons that date to the time Lehi and his family would have been traveling through the region. If you look at every other modern translation of the Bible, all the ones that I can find translate bow of steel, which occurs 3 times in the King James Version of the Bible, as bow of bronze in all of the other translations. It's very likely that Nephi's bow was made of bronze, not of steel as we think of steel today. Why does that matter? Well, think about all the attacks on the Book of Mormon when people say, we haven't found steel in Mesoamerica or in anywhere in the Americas, and therefore the Book of Mormon must be false and it must be a false record. Any museum you go to that has Mesoamerican artifacts, you will see bronze tools everywhere you look. It was one of the most important and most common tools. We find bronze axes, swords, weapons of all sorts in Mesoamerica. And this is likely the steel referenced in the Book of Mormon. Here, for example, is just the Peabody Museum. And this is just a small sampling of all the different bronze weapons that have been excavated out of Mesoamerica. Every major museum around the world will have similar collections showing the vast amount of bronze tools. Now, after Nephi breaks his bow, it says he makes a new wooden arrow. Now, this is an interesting detail that, again, would be elusive for Joseph Smith to try to fabricate. Archery was not in vogue in Joseph Smith's day. Archery wasn't common like it is today because it was seen like Indians and savages were those that used bows and arrows, and so it was looked down upon. And so a general knowledge of archery was not well known across people in Joseph Smith's day. And yet there's this significant detail that when he breaks his bow, even though it doesn't say he damaged his arrows, he makes a new wooden bow and then he makes a new wooden arrow. This small detail, again, witnesses that this is a true account. A copper or a bronze arrow wouldn't work well with a lighter wooden bow. The weight and proportions would be off. And so Nephi has to make new arrows to go with his new wooden bows. Here on the right, this is showing bows and arrows And this is from the Buran Temple in Yemen, and this is from 500 BC, so it dates to the time, within 100 years, of when Lehi and his family would have been traveling through the area. And you see here, the soldiers carry these small composite metal bows in their hands. And of course, bows and arrows were the most common weapon in Arabia in this time frame. Another detail that matches the Book of Mormon account. I want to highlight one other thing, which is if you look in their right hands, you'll see that they have what looks like to be an enlarged hand. The enlarged hand isn't their hand. This is the hand of the enemies they have conquered or vanquished. This was one of the practices in ancient Arabia at the time, that when you would conquer someone, you would cut off their hand or their arm and you would bring it back as a trophy. We see the same thing happening years later in the Book of Mormon, when Ammon goes and cuts off the arms of the Lamanites. And what do the servants of the king of the Lamanites say? They say, "Oh, well, of course, we should pick up these arms and bring them before the king." That's what you do when somebody cuts off a hand or cuts off an arm. These ancient policies and procedures and practices simply weren't known in Joseph Smith's day. So the group leaves Shazer and continues traveling in a south-southeast direction for the space of many days. Somewhere on that journey, Ishmael dies, and it says he is buried in the place which was called Nahom. Now, this is an important element of the story. The other places were places that Lehi had named. Nahom is a place that already existed, that was already there. And that's why it says he was buried in the place which was called Nahom. The wording makes it perfectly clear that it was an existing locally known name and place. And so this verse offers the clearest evidence that Lehi and his party had contact with other people during their journey. They could only have known the name from someone outside of their group. Even though it doesn't reference lots of interaction with people, clearly they were having interaction as they were traveling, and Nahom's a great example of that. I want to show you just a couple things about Nahom. In 1988, German archaeologists unearthed these altars among the ruins of the Buran Temple near Merib. And these altars are the earliest known references to Nahom. They date to 800 to 700 BC, so they were there, already existing when Lehi and his family passed through, and 3 of these altars specifically reference Nahom. This is Daniel Peterson. He says, to find the altars with references to Nahom on them dating to 600 BC was just spectacular. You couldn't have asked for a neater proof that the name was there in the right place at the right time when it was supposed to be for Lehi's group passing through. Now, it's important to understand that Semitic languages have no written vowels. As such, Nahom in Arabic is written NHM, not having any vowels. This NHM, or Nahom, is unique as a place name in all of Arabia. It doesn't exist anywhere else in Arabia. You can't find it in the north, you can't find it in the east, you can't find it in the west. You can only find it at this particular location on the southwestern coast of Arabia. Now, it's not only is it unique, but its name references sorrow and mourning. The Hebrew root is found repeatedly in the Bible and relates to sorrow, hunger, consoling, and mourning. And the Arabic root means to sigh or to moan. Well, this fits perfectly with the idea that they buried Ishmael at Nahom, and the daughters of Ishmael did mourn exceedingly. Nahom would have been a word that meant something to Nephi due to its indication of sorrow and mourning, and is likely why he recorded it in the text. Now, if you think about the daughters of Ishmael mourning for their father, there's an interesting detail here. Even though the Book of Mormon account references the sons of Ishmael numerous times, when Ishmael dies, it only references the daughters as mourning. Here's Hugh Nibley. He said, when Ishmael died on the journey, he was buried in the place which was called Nahom. Note that this is not a place which we called Nahom, but the place which was so called, a desert burial ground. Jocelyn reports that though Bedouins sometimes bury their dead where they die, many carry them great distances to bury them. The Arabic root Nayat, NHM, has the basic meaning of to sigh or to moan, and occurs nearly always in the third form, to sigh or moan with another. At this place, we are told the daughters of Ishmael did mourn exceedingly, and are reminded that among the desert Arabs, mourning rites are the monopoly of women. Among that culture, men are supposed to stand around stoically while the women mourn and lament. In fact, if you go look at just even terrorist attacks in the Middle East today, or you look at people lamenting on the news, next time you see one of those, look how the women are lamenting and mourning and shrieking, and the men stand around stoically. This is a small cultural detail that Joseph Smith simply wouldn't have known in the 1800s. It's according to the customs of that day and even the customs of today. It's important to note that Nephi does not state that Ishmael died at Nahom, only that he was buried there. Well, why would that matter? It's because Nahom is in close proximity to the largest burial complex in Arabia. In all of Arabia, the largest complex is right there in the geographical area of Nahom. And because of that, it would be a proper burial place where you could bury your dead. Because of this, I think of Nahom as a quintuple evidence of the Book of Mormon. First, the name and place existed in Lehi's time. Second, the name is unique and does not appear anywhere else in Saudi Arabia. Third, it is in precisely the right location to match the Book of Mormon's account. Its Arabic root means to sigh or to moan. And lastly, it was near one of the largest burial complexes in Arabia. There's too many details there for it all to be coincidence. This is Daniel Peterson. He says, the finding of Nahom strikes me as just a tremendously significant discovery. What it really is a kind of prediction by the Book of Mormon of something that we ought to find. And to find it in the right location at the right time is a really striking bullseye for the book. And there are those who say the book has no archaeological substantiation. That's a spectacular substantiation right there, it seems to me. Something that would have been unexpected, that it's so unlikely that Joseph Smith could have ever woven into his story on his own. It's a direct bullseye, as precise as you could wish it to be. This quote on the bottom right's from Noel Reynolds, who says, the Book of Mormon text has made a complex prediction, and modern archaeology actually confirms that prediction. Okay, so Nahom is just a tremendous discovery for the Book of Mormon. There's too many small details that simply couldn't be by chance. So how do the critics respond? Critics point to an obscure 1782 map that shows the name Nahom in that geographical location of the world. Now, ironically, the first person to discover this map was Ross T. Christensen from BYU, who was the first to find this map and realize that it had the word Nahom on it for that geographical region. And so the critics of the church say, well, this must be where Joseph Smith saw it. He saw one of these ancient maps, he got the word Nahom, and that's how he put it into the Book of Mormon. Well, there's a couple things you have to believe for that sequence of events to happen. The first is the map was located at Allegheny College, which was 320 miles away from where Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon. There's no evidence Joseph ever went to that college or ever saw the map in its collection of 7,000 books. Additionally, the book collection there required a subscription. In other words, you had to pay money to be able to access the books and have an ongoing subscription to the books. The Smith family was not generally in a position to pay. And we also have a list of all the known subscribers that access the library. No one in the Smith family or any of his associates are on that list. And so it's incredibly unlikely and dubious that Joseph Smith ever saw this map before publishing the Book of Mormon or after the Book of Mormon. Now, even if you believed that somehow he snuck 320 miles, he snuck into this college, he looked through their 7,000 books, he found this one particular map, this one page of all the different maps in the book, and he found the word Nahom, they fail to explain why he only chose to include that one name versus any of the other names on the map. Why go to all the effort if you're not going to exploit it? Additionally, the map shows nothing about Shazer or the paradise place like Bountiful, which he also included in his account. Here's Jeff Lindsay again. He says, if Joseph secretly used a map with Nahom on it, none of which could be shown to have been anywhere near him in order to add local color and build in plausibility or evidence for the authenticity of his tale, why did he and his peers never manage to discover such a map after the Book of Mormon came out in order to give it support? Why go to the trouble and not exploit it? Again, it wasn't until 1978 when someone first realized that ancient maps had the word Nahom on them. Today, we know of at least 10 such maps that list Nahom as the place in southern Arabia. And here you can see a couple of the different versions. None of these maps have been shown to have been known by Joseph or were accessible to him. As such, finding Nahom written on early maps of Arabia doesn't discredit the Book of Mormon. If anything, it further shows that Nahom was an authentic place and it was known as that by that name in that region and those time frames. It's one thing to go tell a bunch of seminary students, see this ancient altar that has this ancient text that you can't read that says NHM on it. It's quite another thing to say in local languages and by explorers that traveled through the region. They documented that area as Nahom on their maps in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. This is Ann Madsen. She says, one has to ask the question, how could Joseph Smith have possibly known Nahom? There's other interesting details in the account. So think about how Ishmael was buried at Nahom, and only after departing Nahom, it says they changed the course they were traveling. And from that time forward, they did travel nearly eastward. Now, think what would have happened if they were along the Incense Trail and they traveled eastward before reaching Nahom. What would have happened is they would have ran smack into the middle of the empty quarter, the largest desert, sand desert on Earth. I want to show you a picture of it so you can just see how large and massive it truly is. From the satellite images here, you can see just an inhospitable terrain. And this is what it looks like in person. It covers 250,000 square miles with the daily high temperatures average 117 degrees in July and August, reaching peaks of 124. There's no water. There's no ability for camels to travel. There's very little life. Surely if they had traveled eastward before reaching Nahom, they would have died in a matter of days on their journey. Now, Nephi's statements implies the groups may have traveled at night without the light of fire. Once you leave Nahom and you head east, you're now in tribal lands. You're no longer in civilized areas that had the control of local sheiks. And so you would constantly be at danger of being robbed or having your possessions stolen by local raiders. As I was preparing for the seminary students, I reread 1 Nephi 17, and this verse stood out to me in a way that it had never stood out before. For the Lord had not hitherto suffered that we should make much fire as we journeyed in the wilderness. For he said, I will make thy food become sweet, that ye cook it not. I had always known that and always realized this was likely because of attracting attention, or desert marauders could have come and robbed them. But this next part I hadn't realized previously. And I will also be your light in the wilderness, and I will prepare the way before you, insomuch as you shall keep my commandments. You shall be led towards the promised land, and you shall know that it is by me that ye are led. It dawned on me that they're most certainly traveling at night. Traveling in the desert heat during the day would have exhausted your strength in just a matter of minutes. And in that area and time place in the world, the Bedouins always traveled at night, and they stopped and rested under their tents and slept during the day. Again, it's a small detail that was woven into the story that would have been hard to conceive of ahead of time and weave it in such a way where the Lord could say, I will be your light and I will lead your way. It's almost as if the pillar of fire that led the Israelites through the desert for 40 years, the Lord's clearly referencing that in telling them he will be their light to lead them through the desert. Okay, so the group journeys towards Bountiful. Now, what do we know about Bountiful? I've prepared here just a list of requirements from various scholars, and obviously you'll recognize these from the text. So things like Bountiful was nearly eastward from Nahom. Its terrain had to permit access from the interior desert to the coast. You obviously couldn't travel across the empty quarter desert. And likewise, they didn't follow along the southern coast. They didn't see the sea again until they reached Bountiful. We know Bountiful was a coastal area. Nephi said, we beheld the sea and we did pitch our tents by the seashore, and we were exceedingly rejoiced when we came to the seashore, and we called the place Bountiful. They haven't seen the sea in a long time, and so this was a period of great rejoicing. It was a large area of fertility, hence they refer to it as the land bountiful. It was a place of much fruit. And we did come to a land which we called Bountiful because of its much fruit. And we called the place Bountiful because of its much fruit. Nephi boarded the ship with much fruits. It was a place of wild honey, even honey in abundance. There was a place where they could obtain meat from the wilderness. It had abundant fresh water resources to sustain all the plants and animals that were described. There was a mountain in close proximity, close enough that Nephi could go there often to pray. Nephi says, I did go into the mount oft, and I did pray oft unto the Lord. It was a place that was suitable for the construction and launching of a sizable ship. That's a unique characteristic where you have to imagine there's not many places along a coast where that would be a true statement. And it had to have a place where there were sufficient materials to build a ship. Well, what sorts of materials? Nephi references needing timbers and ore to molten to make tools. He needed skins of beasts to make bellows wherewith to blow the fire. And he also says he used flint or a similar stone to make fires. I did smite two stones together that I might make fire. We know that Bountiful likely had substantial cliffs overlooking the ocean. Why do we know that? Because at one point, Laman and Lemuel were desirous to throw Nephi into the depths of the sea. You don't do that by taking him out on the sand and pushing him into the water. You clearly throw him off a cliff to do that. So we need to find a place that has cliffs. And perhaps the most striking evidence of all, it has to be a place with little or no existing population who could contribute tools and manpower to building the ship. The Lord tells Nephi where ore can be found, right? Which means he clearly didn't have access to it through trade or through interactions with others. He required the labor of his brethren. There was little to distract Laban and Lemuel and no apparent way for them to join other travelers who could return to Jerusalem or go somewhere else. All things at Bountiful had been prepared by the Lord specifically for their survival and their journey to the promised land. Nephi records all these things were prepared of the Lord. Lehi was told of the destruction of Jerusalem by vision versus through other travelers. That again implies that at this point in their journey, they're not interacting with other people. They're in a remote, isolated place where there's little or no population. How can you find a place such as Bountiful in the desert of Arabia that has little or no population? It seems implausible. I want to call your attention to this satellite photo of Arabia. So the Book of Mormon states that Ishmael died and was buried in the place which was called Nahom. And I've put a star there where the altars depicting Nahom have been found. And it says, and we did travel nearly eastward from that time forth, nearly eastward. If you look at this map and you draw a line nearly eastward, you see this green area here along the coast. This is a quote from Kent Brown. He says, in a satellite photo of Arabia, one sees the little green band of vegetation. That is the Dhofar area of Oman. It lies almost exactly east of the Nahom tribal area. Within that island of greenery on the south coast of Arabia is Bountiful. This is a detail that Joseph Smith could have never fabricated. To assume that there was such a place as Bountiful in Arabia was unknown in his days, and hence received wide criticism when the Book of Mormon was published. Within a year of the Book of Mormon being published, the learned men of the day said it was false because there's no such place in Arabia. As late as 1985, we see botanists and others, professors and doctors saying there's no such place in Arabia. The Book of Mormon makes another interesting detail here. It says, once they departed from Nahom, that they did wade through much affliction from that time forth. Now, why would that be the case? It's because there's no mountain ranges. They're not following the borders near the shore of the Red Sea anymore, where there's food, where there's water runoff, where there's cooler temperatures. Now they're in open desert and they're traveling across. And so Nephi says, we did wade through much affliction, our women did bear children in the wilderness. They are clearly off the beaten path now. I want to show you the CIA map of Yemen. Yes, you can find gospel evidences even on the CIA website. This CIA map shows rainfall in Yemen. And I want to just highlight that if you go from Nahom towards the Dhofar region of Oman, it follows one of the bands where there's slightly more rainfall than in other parts of Yemen. This reminded me of 1 Nephi 16, where it said, we did follow the directions on the ball, which led us in the more fertile parts of the wilderness. How could Joseph Smith possibly know what the most fertile parts of Yemen were in his day and age? He simply couldn't. When you follow the more fertile parts of the wilderness, you arrive in the Dhofar region of Oman, and this is Khor Karfat. It's one of the leading candidates for Bountiful. Now, it's important to understand that Khor Karfat is also known as Wadi Saik. The actual inlet where the water feeds into the ocean is Khor Karfat. That's the inlet. And the valley behind it that supplies the water is Wadi Saik. And so you'll hear scholars talking about Wadi Saik. You'll hear scholars talking about Khor Karfat. It's the same place. The Karfat is just the inlet. Karfat in the local language means the monsoon rains have brought abundance to this place. Now, it's also important to understand the direct rainfall and runoff from the surrounding mountains result in Khor Karfat being the most naturally fertile coastal location on the Arabian Peninsula. There's more fresh water here than anywhere else in Arabia. Here's what the photo looks like from above, and here's the inlet of Khor Karfat, the mouth of the river valley, which is Wadi Sheikh, Wadi just meaning valley. And you might ask yourself, why does this place get so much water when nowhere else in Arabia seems to get water? Well, there's a unique occurrence that happens off the coast. So right off the coast of Khor Karfat, you have the Indian Ocean, which has cool waters that come up from the depths. And there's currents that blow off the northern part of Africa, and they blow across the ocean and they pick up moisture. And when they hit that area there at Khor Karfat, there's a mountain range right behind it. And so as the winds and mists try to go up over the mountain range, they hit the heavy, dense, dry air blowing in from the deserts behind the mountain. And so the mists don't make it over the mountain. They end up being misty all the time, and they end up watering the plants through this ongoing mist. So the mists are blockaded here against the escarpments and the mountains, and therefore they release all their water. And this particular area of Oman receives the greatest amount of rainfall of anywhere in Arabia. Here's what photos of it look like. So this is looking northeast here on the left, and then it's looking southeast from the mouth of the inlet on the right. Here's what it looks like from boat when you approach. Most people that go there today travel by boat to get there because, again, it's so inhospitable and so remote. By the way, Al-Qaeda has operations within 15 miles of Khor Karfat, and so it's a very, very dangerous place to go today. Nephi wrote, "We beheld the sea, and we did pitch our tents by the seashore, and we were exceedingly rejoiced when we came to the seashore, and we called the place Bountiful." You can just envision them being like, yeah, we're going to camp on the sand. We're not even going to go up into the mountains. We want to be on the seashore. We just want to see the water. This was Nephi's first reference to the sea since the time the group left Shazer many years earlier. Here's Noel B. Reynolds. This would have been just an amazing sight to someone who had spent 8 years in that empty quarter of the Arabian Peninsula. Here's what it looks like from the beach. When you stand on the beach, you can see up into the hills. And this is a freshwater lagoon. This is not saltwater. This is fresh water coming down from the mountains there, where the mists water the land, and it accumulates in freshwater springs and flows down to the ocean. Here's looking the other direction from the beach. Now, Nephi wrote that we beheld the sea. There's all sorts of animal life in the seas, even today, in today's modern day and age. You can catch all sorts of sea life and fish and crustaceans, crabs. In fact, you can go on the beach today and just pick up lobsters right off the beach in waist-high deep water. A smaller form of the lobsters than what we're familiar with in the US, but all sorts of animal life teeming there off the coast. As I said, Khor Karfat is fed by 3 large freshwater springs, and it's the largest natural freshwater source on the Arabian Peninsula. And the water remains abundant all year round. So this was a place where you could live and have access to water at any time of the year. I'll read this quote here from Warren Ashton. "Karfat is the largest natural freshwater source on the Arabian Peninsula, surpassing all the other wadis in terms of their volume of water reaching the coast. Drip curtains on the limestone cliffs overlooking the bay and gullies are clear indications that substantial water have drained down into the valley in the past. Today, water remains abundant all year round from 3 large natural springs in the last mile of the Wadi Sheikh." Now, it's interesting to me, and for any of our Mesoamerican friends on the phone, or Mesoamericanists who study the Book of Mormon and the evidences of people in Mesoamerica, it's striking to me that whenever you read any of the legends in Mesoamerica, they talk about the place of the forefathers being the place of the cattail reeds. Let me read this quote here by Alan Christensen, who was one of the translators of the Popol Vuh, the Maya book of religious writings. He said, "Inscriptions refer to the central Mexican city of Teotihuacan as Pu, place of the cattail reeds. This is the Maya language version of Tolan, Nahuatl for the place of the cattail reeds, the legendary founding place of the arts and sciences, as well as the political power and legitimacy. This title was given to a number of major centers, including Teotihuacan, Cholula, Chichen Itza, and Tenochtitlan. It is likely that the concept is even older, dating to Olmec traditions in the southern Gulf Coast region, tied to the legends of the birth of the world from the primordial sea. The reeds represent the first life to emerge from the place of origin. If Hunahpu is related to this concept, the title could be interpreted as the one first he of the place of the cattail reeds, meaning that the deity pertains to the legendary founding place of the Mesoamerican civilization, or the place of original creation. Several of the other writings from Thomas Herbert and others in the Legends of the Serpent talk about the founders of Mesoamerica traveling across the ocean from a place of cattail reeds. In the 1937 translation of one of the early Mayan books, it calls Tulan the place of abundance, wording which is identical to that used by in the Spanish translation of the Book of Mormon when it refers to the Old World, Bountiful, the place of abundance. I don't know for sure that the references to the founding place of the cattail reeds ties to Bountiful in the Old World, but it is an interesting coincidence and an interesting thought. So when they get to Bountiful, they describe it as a place of much fruit, and we called the place Bountiful because of its much fruit, and Nephi provisioned his ship with much fruits in the plural. At Kor Karfat, we find all sorts of wild fruits growing completely without the assistance of man, just growing completely wild. And I want to show just a handful of them to you. There's documented grapes, dates, figs, olives, cucumbers, melons, gourds, plums, wild jasmine, milkweed pods, limes, tamarind, passion fruit, reeds, berries, seeds, herbs, roots, and nuts, including pistachios. Here on the right, you can see some photos. There's olives, wild olives on the top right. You can see dates on the bottom right. A wild cucumber just growing there in the center top, and then a species of wild grapes that are edible below that cucumber. Laureen Wustenhume, who's a ecology professor at BYU, traveled to Kor Karfat, and she wrote that the species diversity is unreal in that region, producing copious amounts of pollen as well as copious amounts of nectar. Here's what some of those wild grapes look like up close. So you can see the type of grapes that Lehi and his family may have been eating. And this is a milkweed pod, which is unfamiliar to most Americans, but it grows commonly in the region, and it's prized by the locals. It's relished for its taste. They claim it tastes like young pea pods, and so they're collected in great abundance. Now, perhaps most astonishing of all, Bountiful was a place of wild honey, even honey in abundance. This was a radical claim and something that was called out early in the publication of the Book of Mormon, and again called out even in our lifetimes as being impossible in Arabia. And yet these are photos of wild honey growing at Kor Karfat, there on the coast in the Dhofar region of Oman. Nephi wrote, "And we did come to the land which we called Bountiful, because of its much fruit and its wild honey." That's why they called it Bountiful. It was because of the fruit and the honey. This is a picture from Kor Karfat with a bee pollinating a flower. And it's not just that it had wild honey. Nephi tells us that it was a place of honey in abundance. Well, what do you need to have honey in abundance? You need abundant flowers. I just wanted to show you a couple photos of the massive numbers of fields of flowers and plant life that exists at Kor Karfat, that the bees gather their pollen and nectar. Here's a few more photos you can see of the different types of plants that grow in abundance there. So we know that Bountiful was a place that had sufficient timbers to build a ship. This seems, very unusual to say that there'd be timbers in the deserts of Arabia, and yet all of these photos here are photos of trees growing at Kor Karfat. There's a remarkable variety of trees, including large tamarind trees and fig trees, which would have likely been used. Nephi wrote, "And we did work timbers of curious workmanship, and the Lord did show me from time to time after what manner we should work the timbers of the ship." Here's a tree being watered by the mists as those winds blow in from the ocean current, and then turn into droplets of water that water the vegetation. And here on the right, I thought I would just show you an acacia tree. There are many different kinds of acacia tree that grow here, but it's a strong wood that was used anciently for the ribs of ships, and so it's very possible that it was similarly with Nephi, that he used the acacia wood also in his shipbuilding. Here's looking up into the valley during the rainy season, and I just wanted to highlight the vast number and varieties of trees that are available. Now, we know from Nephi's account that Bountiful was in close proximity to a mountain. We know that because Nephi said he would go to the mountain often to pray. Here's the Wadi Sake, the river valley here in blue, and then you can see the mouth here, the inlet, Khor Karfat. And I want to point your attention to this mountain. It's 1,300 feet tall. It borders the inlet and it's directly west of the inlet. Here's what it looks like from the ground. I can just imagine in my mind's eye this being the place where their tents are pitched there on the seashore, and Nephi says, I did go into the mount often and I did pray oft to the Lord. Here's another view from behind the freshwater lagoon with the backside of the mountain. Now at Khor Karfat, there's obviously cliffs on that mountain. Cliffs where it could be plausible, where it says Nephi wrote that Laman and Lemuel were desirous to throw me into the depths of the sea. Here you can see one of the cliffs and how that would have been possible right there from a close location to where they were camping on the seashore. Now, Nephi said he needed a supply of ore to molten to make tools. When the Lord commanded Nephi to go build a ship, it's interesting and instructive that he didn't say first, well, how do I build tools? He already knew that. He was already a metallurgist. He had already learned that sometime in his prior youth. He said, Lord, whither shall I go that I might find ore to molten, that I make tools to construct a ship? Now, this is a curious statement, something for Joseph Smith to write, because it would be impossible for him to know, but Nephi's question makes it clear that ore is not plentiful in that region. If not, Nephi would have said, oh, I'll go get the ore and I'll start making the tools. I want to give you two quotes here. First, there's no documented occurrences of copper of any kind of ore in southern Arabia along the coast, from a geologist from BYU. And then Jeffrey Keith, another geologist, said there are no sizable deposits of any metals in the Dhofar region of Oman. And so if this green strip of paradise on the Arabian coast is bountiful, we have a problem. There's no ore here with which to make tools, and hence Nephi has to turn to the Lord, and the Lord has to reveal it to him. Now, I want to share with you that in 2000, a group of BYU geology professors traveled to Khor Karfat and the Arabian Peninsula, and they found two small sources of iron ore that could have been sources to Nephi. They reported to the Ministry of Mines of Oman, and this is the quote that Ron Harris gives. The Ministry of Mines, whose personnel really know more about the geology of Oman than anyone, confirmed that these were new discoveries, and that and that means that no one knew about them until the year 2000. So until the year 2000, it was believed that there was no deposits of ore of any kind along the southern coast of Arabia until these two sources were found. And it's instructive that one of the sources is very close under Khor Karfat, also again known as Wadi Sake. There are only two places along the coast, a large area near Bat and another small one near Wadi Sake, where there is really any iron ore at all. The limited availability of metals on the southern coast of Arabia is a detail that Joseph Smith simply could not have known in the 1800s. Now, not only does it have ore, but there's something very remarkable about this ore. I'm going to read this quote by Revel Phillips. He says, the iron ore in these two areas is right on the surface of the ground. We have veins of iron ore coming up through the metamorphic rock right to the surface of the ground. And so collecting it would have been no problem at all. Nephi could have collected enough iron ore in a matter of a few minutes to make all the tools he would want. Here on the right, he shows it. You can look at the different colorization where his hands are at relative to the rock around it. That is iron ore right on the surface of the ground. You don't even have to mine it. You can just pick it up off of that mountain. Here's a quote from Jeffrey Keith, a geology professor at BYU. He said, what makes this find unique is the very soft pulverant limonite, which is an iron with a little bit of water in the structure, and also iron carbonate. This is remarkable because by having those two things occur in the same rock, you have an iron ore that is much more easily smelted. I have never seen any iron ore like this any place in the world. To me, the Lord did everything possible to make this easy to use. This was the ideal mixture for a layman. You just have to go dig it up with your hands and it's ready to go. The availability of iron ore near Bountiful is one of the most remarkable testaments to the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. To date, iron ore has only been found in 2 locations on the entire southern coast of Arabia, one near Mirbat and the other near Khor Karfat. Now, there's another detail that just strikes me as so inconceivable that Joseph Smith could have fabricated this. It's whenever you read a verse in the Book of Mormon that seems out of place, I always get excited because it means that something unusual is going on. And if something unusual is going on, it means at some point in the future, we will find evidence that testifies to what's going on that verse. After arriving in Bountiful, Nephi makes a statement that seems completely out of place with the rest of the text. He says, "That I might have wherewith to blow the fire, I did smite 2 stones together, that I might make fire." Think about how unusual this statement is. Throughout this entire 8-year journey, they don't tell us what they ate for breakfast. They don't tell us how they used the restroom or where they stopped to get water or who they interacted with. They don't even tell us Nephi's wife's name. And yet he takes the time in the record to say that at Bountiful, he's smiting 2 stones together to make fire. How strange. Nowhere else in the Book of Mormon do they talk about their cooking or their eating habits or how they make fire. And yet here we see this indication. The reason that's striking to me is because when you walk inland there from the inlet, Khor Karfat, and you go up into the mountain, here's what you see. You see these massive veins of chert, a form of flint, right into the walls of the mountain. You couldn't walk up the mountain without seeing these large veins of flint. And when you strike that flint together, it creates sparks to create fire. This seems like a detail too obscure, too small to be coincidence. This is a detail that shows this account is an authentic account of people that traveled to the Dhofar region of Oman. Now, perhaps the greatest evidence of all for Bountiful is that it had little or no existing population. And to set this up, I want to just share with you the population densities per square mile of Hillsboro, where we first lived when we got married. There's 4,400 people per square mile. We moved to Chandler, Arizona, which has about 3,800 people per square mile. Then we moved to South Jordan, which has about 3,600. And we currently live in Folsom, California, which has about 2,700 people per square mile. With everything I've shown you about Khor Karfat and the tropical paradise that it is, you would assume that it has a great population. The population of Khor Karfat today has a population density of 1 to 4 people per square mile. That's not 1 to 4,000, that's 1 to 4 people per square mile. Even to this day, it is extremely remote and uninhabited. You can see here population density of Yemen on the left and population density of Oman on the right. These are extremely sparsely populated areas. Why? Because they're so remote and difficult to get to that you simply don't have large populations living there. I want to show you a satellite photo of the closest settlement to Khor Karfat. So I've highlighted Khor Karfat on the right, and you can see about 3 miles distance from Khor Karfat is this small settlement. You can see there's a dozen or so houses here. Even to this day, in the 21st century, Khor Karfat has almost no population. I want to read a quote here from Jeff Lindsay. A remarkable correlation between Nephi's Bountiful and Khor Karfat is not just that it's a rare fertile location on the coast nearly due east of Nahom, but that it was and largely still is an uninhabited fertile spot. Fertile spots with fresh water tend to attract settlement, especially in Arabia. But Nephi's Bountiful clearly lacked population. He was not in a major port town, but an uninhabited but highly livable spot the family apparently had to themselves. What are the odds of such a place being found anywhere in Arabia, much less exactly where the Book of Mormon said it should be? It's one thing to guess that an area on the coast might be unusually fertile and suitable for people to live. It's another thing to guess that nobody lives there. No map would have helped Joseph do that. And so the point is that Khor Karfat remains a sparsely uninhabited fertile area to this day. This is a remarkable witness of Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon, something that would have been unimaginable, and in fact was unimaginable in Joseph Smith's day and age. Remember, a year after the Book of Mormon was published, the first attacks were about finding a place in Arabia among the desert and barren wilderness. And so what do we see about Khor Karfat and Wadi Sheikh? It's nearly eastward from Nahom. It's accessible from the interior desert to the coast. It was on the coast. It was a large area of fertility. There was much fruit, wild honey. It offered meat from the wilderness, abundant sources of fresh water. There was a mountain in close proximity. It was suitable for constructing and launching a ship right there from the freshwater bay. It had sufficient resources to build a ship, including ore, timber, and flint. It likely had cliffs overlooking the ocean and little or no population. I like this picture of a camel here at Khor Karfat. When I showed this to my wife, she said, "Is that photoshopped?" And I said, "No, that's a real camel at Khor Karfat, wandering in from the desert. You can't make this stuff up." The inconceivability and implausibility of finding a place such as Bountiful is a remarkable witness to the Book of Mormon. So as we close the fireside, I want to just recap a few things. In Joseph Smith's time, the entire educated world, Europe and America, believed that the Arabian Peninsula was just one big desert that went from one seacoast to the other. And for Joseph to describe inland routes of travel, but especially fertile places like Bountiful, he described, was really quite foreign to what would have been expected and extremely dubious. So to find places that look just like that turns out to be really quite remarkable. Let's quickly summarize what we've talked about in the fireside today. First, the necessity of fleeing to Arabia. Being surrounded in 600 BC, this idea of fleeing into the desert was not unimaginable. In fact, it was the only plausible option for Lehi's family. We've talked about the absolute consistency in the use of elevation as Nephi travels up to Jerusalem and back down to the land of his family's inheritance. We've talked about the phrase, the land of Jerusalem. It's used 40 times in the Book of Mormon, even though it's not found in the Bible. However, it has been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Amarna letters, both of which were discovered well after Joseph Smith's day. We've talked about Laban commanding 50 men. The Amarna letters reference 50 men as the standard unit for a garrison of that period. Also, letters from the Assyrian and Babylonian empires also indicate 50 men was the standard military unit. We've talked about how Nephi acquired metallurgy skills, and he passed the mines of Timna at least 5 times, those mines which were in operation in his day. We've talked about how they camped by a valley in a valley by a river by the side of the water, and how Wadi Tayyib-al-Izm is a plausible candidate for that valley. We've spoken about how Laman and Lemuel had extra reason to murmur, being entitled to a double portion of the birthright. We've mentioned how gathering seeds on the borders of the Red Sea happened to grow well in Mesoamerica, which implies that we are at a similar latitude. It happens to correspond to where all the ancient massive civilizations during Book of Mormon time periods are based. We've spoken about Lehi making offerings only after traveling 3 days into the journey, and why Nephi goes to great pains to make that clear in his record, that first they traveled 3 days in the wilderness, then they stopped to make their offerings. This is in accordance with the law found in the temple scroll, which prohibits sacrifices within a 3 days journey of the temple of Jerusalem. We've talked about how the Mosaic law prohibited the consumption of desert animals, such as the hyena, the wolf, and the leopard, and may indicate why they suffered for such lack of food, and yet at the same time, Nephi was in danger of being devoured by wild beasts. We've mentioned plausible candidates for Shazer that are within a 4-day journey of the Valley of Lemuel. And we've talked about traveling on the mountain borders. The group traveled in the wilderness and the borders which are nearer the sea. The local Arabs state that the name of the mountains in the northwest Arabia, the Hijaz, means borders. Could Joseph Smith have created all this from his imagination? Could he have understood that they were following the ancient incense trade routes when they were traveling on the borders there on the eastern side of the mountain range? Or that the bows would lose their tension as they traveled in the journey due to the rise in temperature? What about Nephi's bow of fine steel and how it was translated bow of bronze in all the other biblical translations? Even though it was prevalent in Arabia, bronze was not mentioned in King James Version of the Bible or the Book of Mormon, and how Nephi's bow may have been made of bronze. Nephi made a new wooden arrow to go with his new wooden bow. Would Joseph Smith have known to weave that detail into the story? Or how in that day and age, cutting off people's hands and arms was a symbol of victory in battle. or how the bow and arrow was the most common weapon used in ancient Arabia. Could Joseph Smith possibly have conceived of Nahom? Nahom, which has been found, the name itself being found on 3 altars as well as on maps of Arabia. It's been shown that the name existed during Lehi's time. It refers to a place, and it was unique and did not appear as a place name anywhere else in Saudi Arabia. It's in precisely the right location to match the Book of Mormon account, and its Arabic root means to sigh or to moan. And lastly, it was near one of the largest burial complexes in Arabia, a place where you could naturally bury Ishmael. We've spoken about how early maps of Arabia show the name Nahom. To date, at least 10 different maps have been found. None are known to have been near Joseph or accessible to him. The critics have failed to explain why one name among hundreds on the map would be plagiarized, nor have they explained why Joseph would include locations such as Shazer and Bountiful on the account when no such places are depicted on the map. We've talked about the Arab mourning practices and how they were the monopoly of women, and how even though the Book of Mormon references the sons of Ishmael, it's the daughters who did mourn exceedingly. We've spoken about how traveling nearly eastward only happened after they passed by Nahom. Traveling eastward before Nahom would have led them right into the empty quarter desert. And after traveling eastward from Nahom, they immediately began to suffer a more difficult journey and much affliction, having left the main body of the Incense Trail and left the mountain ranges. And we've talked about how Bountiful was nearly eastward from Nahom. And how you can see, even from satellite to this day, that area of green paradise on the Arabian Peninsula. Recall the attack of the critics, the first slide that we showed in this presentation. Did their claims destroy or support the Book of Mormon? Here again is 1831. To believe the Book of Mormon, we must suppose that these immigrants discovered a country almost equal to paradise, where nobody else can find anything but a sandy, barren desert. So is there a plausible candidate for Bountiful on the Arabian coast? The answer is yes. Did Joseph Smith fabricate this story out of thin air? The answer is no. It is a true historical account. This quote from Daniel Peterson is on the right, and it says, "The idea that Joseph Smith was really well versed in pre-Islamic Arabian geography or customs in the desert seems to me so ludicrous as to simply be beyond belief." And it is beyond belief. Joseph Smith did not fabricate this story with all of these outrageous details. He translated this from an ancient record that was given him by an angel of the Lord using the gift and power of God. The existence of a place almost equal to paradise in Arabia is not the story's Achilles heel, as many have claimed. It is the story's crowning evidence. It testifies that the Book of Mormon is a true historical record. So as we close the fireside, I just want to invite my friends, family members, associates, those who have left the church, those whose testimonies are waning, to remember Doctrine and Covenants section 9. In D&C 9, the Lord says that you took no thought save it were to ask me, but you have to first study it out in your mind and see if it be right. And if you do this, and then ask the Lord, by the power of the Holy Ghost, we will come to know the truth of all things. I know that promise is true because I have done that promise. I have studied these things out in my mind. I have searched diligently for the evidences and have found them in abundance. And as such, when I go and pray to the Lord, the confirming power of the Holy Ghost, that power that is greater than any archaeological evidence, has witnessed to my soul that these things are true, that Joseph Smith really was a true prophet. I invite all of you and all those in the sound of my voice to do the same. And I do that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.